Hi.
Hey everybody. So we've got a lot that we're going to be going through, so we'll try to get through it pretty quickly. Goldie and I are going to talk about this topic mainly in terms of the game that we're working on, Wayward Strand. Oh yeah, that's that thing. Wayward Strand, you don't need to know too much about it before we get started, except for the fact that it's an interactive story set in a small coastal town in southern Victoria from the 27th to the 29th of January, 1978, and also that it's got an airborne hospital. So it's an interesting mix of elements. How did we get there? When our teammate Russell came up with the initial idea for Wayward Strand, we talked quite a bit about where it could be set. At that point, we had the airborne hospital, but it could have been set anywhere, in a real place or a fantasy place. At the time, I'd been listening to short fiction podcasts, particularly the New Yorker fiction podcast, on which a writer chooses a story from the archives to read and discuss. After the reading, the writer and podcast host, Deborah Treisman, often speak about the author of the piece and discuss how the story links to the author's life and history. I was fascinated by how many of the stories were being set in locations and at times that had personal significance to the author. To highlight an example, Stephanie Vaughan's stories that have been read on the podcast, Abel Baker, Charlie Dog, and Dog Heaven from a collection, Sweet Talk, both from an army brat's perspective, exploring daily life on military bases. And Stephanie Vaughan herself grew up on military bases. Her family followed her father around to these bases through the years of her childhood. However, none of these stories are autobiographical. They're drawn from her life, but not based on her life. Listening to her stories really awoke in me a realization that this was something that you could do. Set a story in a place and time that you have a personal connection to, and how that could be interesting and powerful. So I'm just going to pass over to Goldie, but I just wanted to say to read Sweet Talk because it's really, really good.
Hello. One of the most captivating and earliest exposures for me of neorealism in indie art was when I discovered American Daniel Clow's long-form graphic novel Ghost World. Ghost World follows Enid Coleslaw and Rebecca Doppelmayr, two cynical, pseudo-intellectual teenage girls recently graduated from high school in the early 90s. What really captured my curiosity was the way that the novel, as well as the 2001 film adaptation, follows the two teens as they spend their days wandering aimlessly around their unnamed American town, criticizing popular culture and the everyday Americans they encounter. Especially notable in this small town, and still present in our towns and cities, is the slowly encroaching franchises which smother the town's individuality. The story regularly highlights characters who are almost the antithesis to the normalization of behavior and social exchange. It's hardly revolutionary, but it was quintessentially realistic, a light shining on the quirk of the everyday. Ghost World was hugely influential in my expectations for myself as an artist. It taught me how to appreciate the small stuff which gets ignored by Warner Brothers and Disney and even local mainstream media. Realism in games has usually meant photorealism, whereas realism or neorealism in literature, art, and film has constantly been more about social context, historical actuality, and political commitment to progressive social change. Robert Yang's recent short article on realism in games is worth a read to cover this better than me. Anyway, when I arrived at uni, eventually to study games, it was surprising to me. It was surprising to me to see that there wasn't yet much exploration of the slice of life genre in games, and even less social realism in games. There was some. The closest example I came across with glee was Dysphoria by Anna Anthropy, who used games to talk about her experiences with transitioning. And likewise, when I discovered Escape from Woomera, which is Catherine Neal's extremely confident Half-Life mod, which explores Australia's ongoing disgraceful treatment of asylum seekers, I nearly exploded with hope for games. Papers, Please by Lucas Pope. Far out. Papers, Please by Lucas Pope is another popular example of a reality-informed game for political expression, and Richard Hoffmeyer's Cart Life is perhaps the ultimate realist game, but to get into something as breathtakingly perfect as that is going to require a different talk. So when I got to uni, I decided with my friends to make a game inspired by Daniel Clowes and the mundane and set it within my fictionalised memories of growing up in Melbourne. We called it Movement Study 1. I chose Australian artists like Howard Arkley to inspire a lot of the visual design on key parts of the short game, knowing that in the 70s he had also tried to extract the beauty from his mundane suburban Melburnian experience. Like Ghost World, it focused on a loosely autobiographical version of myself through two characters who wrestle with their evolving post-high school friendships. I just wanted to see if it worked in Melbourne, and of course it did. It was a successful project as far as our intention for it goes. Since then, in 2013, we've been lucky to see games such as Gone Home, and more recently Paperbark, set in and about the Australian bush, and Knuckle Sandwich, another Australian endeavour at personal expression through interaction, with less of a real-world setting, but with so much autobiographical content. I learned through practice that the game space, like literature and film before it, was ripe for real-world settings and stories. Since making Movement Study 1, I have worked on a handful of private, small, unreleased games, illustrations, and stories about the lives of people from Australia, including but not restricted to family history. When Jason and Russell approached me about working on Wayward Strand, it was an instant fit. All they had to do was mention that they were wanting to create a game set in Australia in the 70s, and I was interested. Through exploring more about the history of the time and place, we have constantly been confronted with terrible stories of injustice, as well as with a plethora of unique country life aesthetics to draw upon, and have the benefit of the lens of contemporary awareness to know which points to focus on. Wayward Strand is my second attempt in a team at writing and crafting a richly Australian story based on fictional characters informed by stories and histories I have come across. Because of the depth of history, both healthy and frankly fucked up, I don't doubt that Wayward Strand will eventually prove to be a successful exercise in real-world fictional narrative games.
Cool. So we thought we should have a slide that breaks down what we see as the key benefits of setting a game in a real place and time. We'll be talking quite a bit about how the how of doing this as well. So maybe if you wanted to take a picture of the slide to remember the benefits. And it's important to know that many of these benefits apply regardless of whether your game has a strong narrative component or not. The benefits are, in brief, if you make a game that's set in a place that has personal significance to you, it's likely that it will have significance to other people in your family and community as well, and they'll potentially be able to help with your research process. In our case, we were particularly lucky with this, which Goldie will speak to later, but reaching out to your local community is how you can find people who are able to be great resources in this regard. Once you set your story in a real time and place, it provides a scaffolding for your story as you're building it. You're still going to be telling your story, but having it set somewhere specific is incredibly helpful for overcoming the blank page. It's a real place. It exists or existed, and you can keep finding out more about it and then using the results of what you find in your game. Relating to that, a real place and time is a treasure trove for influences and idea-generating facts or stories. Think of it as the most comprehensive lore you could possibly imagine, and there are likely to be virtually limitless resources to draw from. We certainly found this anyway. And finally, your work of art gains an immediate significance to real people's lives, the people who live in that place now or lived there before, or who have parents or ancestors who lived in that place. This provides meaning to your project beyond your personal creative impulses, and acts as a good incentive to actually finish what you've started, because you're now contributing to a continuum of cultural works about this place and time.
Getting deeper into the personal connections I am able to draw upon with this particular project, my mother Liz worked in the 70s, 80s and 90s as a charge nurse in emergency departments across Melbourne. She also grew up rurally and has been an unparalleled resource for knowledge of the time and of experiences in hospitals. We've been able to base entire characters on her stories, as well as moments with almost all of the patients, let alone the actual day-to-day running of the hospital. Vocal mannerisms, routines, and expectations on the staff, behaviours of the patients, ways for the staff to have fun, ways for them to get away with it. The hard parts and the sad parts. There were some things we couldn't include, especially stuff which happens after dark in hospitals on slow nights, such as Crutch's cricket. But learning about the culture of people working in these places at the time has been wonderful. Like Mum, my dad Jim was also involved in hospitals during his career. He was a senior health architect and was the lead designer on many of Melbourne's large and small-scale hospitals and health facilities. I grew up in a house full of reams of AO paper with architectural plans for hospitals, as well as notebooks full of questions and thoughts which I never really understood. Approaching Wayward Strand as a designer in the architectural mindset was definitely enriched because of this. Ship architecture, on the other hand, was less known to me, but luck has it that my grandfather, also Jim, was a ship's engineer, and his World War II ship, the HMAS Castlemaine, is still docked and accessible in Williamstown, and the public are welcome to tour any time. Merging hospitals and ships is pretty tough, though, so we'll see how that goes. Another thing I've been able to draw upon is the experience I had with my dad in the last 5 years of his life. He died in 2016 after a long sickness which caused him the need to live in a handful of nursing homes around Melbourne. Visiting him every few days was pretty difficult after a while. Nursing homes these days generally are unpleasant places, usually due to the tiny amount of funding available to them, as well as the task of managing older, sick and dying people of diverse backgrounds with differing care requirements. I spent many after work and uni afternoons with him, updating him on how my life was changing, or whilst his was stagnant and drawing to a close. He died about 5 weeks after I started working on Wayward Strand, and I've scribbled a huge amount of observations of the patients, the buildings, the routines and the feelings from those environments into the game. It's been very healing for me, I think, to have had a project so immediately relevant to what could have otherwise been left to simmer. Knowing that the nursing home in our game is slightly different. It's luxurious, it's one of the first, and it's more like an optional living arrangement for some of the patients, and this feels like a good thing. To really capture the greyness and frankly macabre tone of a contemporary nursing home isn't what we want to do with Wayward Strand, but knowing about it really helps. Kind of like pushing an idea as far as it can go and choosing which parts are gentle and true enough to include in a family-friendly video game.
So that's like a shot of Wayward Strand at the moment. I'm going to give a pretty specific example that came out of talking to Goldie's mum, Liz, which is a pretty minor spoiler. At one point, we had a storyline that revolved around a character's desire to be euthanized, and then that desire being blocked by the hospital staff. It made a bunch of sense to us when we thought of it, and it's a topic that we're interested in and initially wanted to explore in the story, but as we spoke to Liz, she let us know that at the time, this is 50 years ago at this point, euthanasia wasn't really the hot button topic that it is at the moment. And if the hospital staff, the hospital staff would basically euthanize patients if they desired it. The staff used a euphemism for it. It was described as making the patient more comfortable, and then they would just crank up the morphine and let the patient pass quietly in the night. This is not only a really interesting fact to know about our setting that has a lot to potentially explore in and of itself, but we've been able to change that character's story to be more suitable to the time and to be more unique as well. Now, instead of the storyline being very directly related to the hot button topic, which is already being covered quite well in other media, such as the late great Terry Pratchett's documentary Choosing to Die, our storyline has become more about that particular character's struggle for empowerment and being given the right to make her own choices.
There's something which belongs to the people when you use media, especially media traditionally used commercially to depict realism. Making work which comments on reality can be a powerful historical tool, both as documentation and representative of large social issues. Take, for example, one of the most significant paintings from the early realism period, The Gleaners, an everlong masterpiece by Frenchman Jean-François Millet, completed in 1857. The painting depicts, in an unadorned manner, 3 peasant women gleaning a field of stray stalks of wheat after the harvest, which they will use to feed their impoverished families. It is a sympathetic representation of the lowest ranks of rural society, and in 1857 it was extremely poorly received by the French upper class, who were the prime audience for paintings like this at the time. Even the middle classes, fresh on the other side of the French Revolution in 1848, were upset by the painting. To them it was a reminder that French society was built upon the hard labour of the working masses, and landowners linked this with empathy towards socialism, which was very uncool at the time. The Gleaners, as well as other paintings and works of literature from this period, were instrumental in broadening the perspectives of entire generations, thus shaping the course of history to become more inclusive, fair, and considerate. Even pieces such as the slightly problematic Pride and Prejudice from 1813 have used reality to create social commentary and critique. Whilst this isn't literally my personal history, it has helped to shape the reality that we all live in. By now it's the norm. Artists across all media are regularly drawing upon the real world for their work. To use music as an example, there was a fresh wave of social critique with the hip-hop movement, as well as with the political American punk movement in the 70s. Avant-garde art in the early 20th century with movements like Dada and outsider art in Europe are also significant, and the list goes on. Making art hasn't always been and isn't always political, but it can be, and if games are art, we can and should go there when we can, especially when we have things to say. This is one of the reasons why amplifying voices which aren't traditionally as loud as mine or maybe yours is something vital for large-scale cultural progress. In the 70s in Australia, following consultations and through general knowledge, we can paint one picture of rural Australian life at the time. It's been covered in movies like the popular Puberty Blues, which shows the awkward, difficult, and painfully slow, and sometimes painfully fast moments of growing up by the beach. It's heard in the music of the time. Notably, Australia's rock and even punk music scene at the time was always the voice of a working class people demanding better conditions and poetically capturing the conditions of their everyday lives. We can see snippets of vastly celebrated Australian culture by watching football and cricket reruns, even if they were and perhaps continue to be pretty bad news as far as toxic masculinity goes. Less discussed than sport culture in the public forum at the time were some of Australia's more despicable histories. For example, the government's cultural treatment of women, queer people, and most markedly perhaps its unforgivable and unforgettable treatment of Indigenous Australians. In the 1970s, this was still, and I think continues to be, shameful. When the team met with Land Council member Uncle Chris to discover more about being young and Indigenous at the time, he and I had a blast talking about the music scene in the 70s, but we also uncovered some very hard truths which have helped us shape the experiences of another young character on board the ship.
So in regards to Indigenous consultation, we also talked with Dan Turnbull from the Bunurong Land Council, and he let us know stories of the Bunurong who lived there and still live on the land where the story is set, and really gave us a primer on Bunurong culture and society from his perspective. We initially got in touch with the Bunurong Land Council through Dakota Bakker in Queensland, and we didn't really know what to expect, but it turned out that Dan loves games and has a great understanding of what we were going for and was able to give specific, pointed feedback and advice. One of the particular things that we came to Dan about was that, as Goldie mentioned, we wanted to have a Bunurong character in the game, a young Bunurong man. But we were worried about the ethics and the outcome for the community of having a Bunurong character without having Bunurong representation on our team. But what Dan told us was, obviously it would be great for us to have representation on the team, but we should still go ahead with it from his perspective. He sees it as a net positive thing, something he's excited about as a Bunurong man, and he gave us some pointers and guidance for how to do it in a way that he'd find respectful and worthwhile, as well as letting us know how to get more Bunurong folks involved. And now it's important to note that we shouldn't assume that he speaks for all Bunurong people or that this is some license or grant to do this. But it means that from a personal perspective, we felt more sure of ourselves in including this character, and that we had a better idea of how we could include him in a way that wouldn't be detrimental to the Bunurong community. Consultation isn't like a box to tick off or something that you can use to make yourself immune from criticism. Criticism is great. It's healthy and valuable, especially when it comes from people who are more marginalized or less privileged than you. Instead, consultation is an ongoing process that empowers you to make your creative work more relevant to more people. Every discussion that we've had so far has given us further insight, more interesting elements of the setting to explore, and has enriched the final player experience.
If you're able to pile into a car or a bus with your team and visit areas which you might want to explore, absolutely do it. When I was making movement study, I originally wanted to set it where I grew up in Port Melbourne. But as it turns out, my artist and I decided to meet in Brunswick, which is a more common area for our generation to have grown up in. There weren't very many kids in Port Melbourne, and so it wasn't as well known as Brunswick. This was definitely the right decision, as multi-generations of Melburnians instantly recognised exactly where the game was set. When Adrian and I went to Brunswick, we spent time walking around and taking photos and footage of the old houses lining the streets. Small details popped out, for example, how the gardens were kept, where wheelie bins were stored, how much signage there was, the condition of the footpaths, leaf litter, how much traffic there was at that time of day, etc. Even just being able to grab a palette from the walk was useful. It made the biggest difference to the game, I think, of anything else we did, and so when Wayward Strand decided where it might be best for our game to be set, we decided to head off. We booked a house for the weekend and took cameras and microphones and notebooks and planned visits to local historical societies and places of interest. We got a huge amount done just that weekend, walking around on the windswept beaches and getting our boots wet in the sand, as well as climbing over sandbanks, eating fish and chips at the local fish and chippery, all helped place us in the mindset of what living and growing up there might be like. Watching kids the same age as our main character, 14-year-old Casey, running around at the local markets, dragging their parents around, or loitering behind the library with their bikes. Of course, things have changed since the 70s, but the visits to the historical societies helped us out there. We learned by chance that the closest large town to where we were was in fact where the largest rural hospital was at the time, and that plenty of nurses and doctors had lived in that town back then. Just a happy coincidence. We walked through the streets, documenting houses which could have belonged to our characters, all the time fleshing them out into the richly sculpted people they are today. Small details, like whether someone needed to paint their fence, or whether someone had the champion roses of the street, were all there for us to pick up on and include. More recently, we did a second beach trip to a different part of the Victorian coastline, just as a location scouting expedition. Kind of surprisingly, the history we had discovered during our first trip to Inverloch was extremely different to the history of this millionaire's playground, Sorrento, even though they're only a few hundred kilometres apart. It was only a short trip, and we spent a lot of the time either relaxing or focusing on other parts of running our studio, but at least we were able to ask ourselves, did sunburnt knees feel the same in the 70s?
So putting the game in this setting, having characters and stories that are informed by our own memories and life experiences, like this gives us a structure, scaffolding in which to create our story. It gives us tons of material to draw from and is a universe that already makes sense. And the fact that it's so personal to us is a big factor, I think, in us still being excited about the project 2.5 years in. As an example of one of the many benefits that have come up, Goldie, found this book of short stories by older folks published in 1999, from the area that our game is set. It's full of stories by people whose lived experience is way closer than ours to the time that our characters would have been living in. And here's another example of a benefit that's come up. That our animation lead, Klonika, is visiting Europe at the moment, and she went to the V&A Ocean Liners exhibit in London, and she posted dozens of incredible photos for source material for our ship on Slack, spurring tons of fascinating questions. The answers to these questions will further enrich the player's experience. A question we keep asking ourselves, during this process, is why are so many games seemingly set by default in fantasy or sci-fi settings? Of course, do that if that makes sense for your game, but why not have the default be a real setting, a real time and place in history or a contemporaneous setting, and open your project up to these really exciting possibilities?
Well, thank you for listening to our experiences and some of the reasons behind why we take this stuff as an opportunity. I hope it's given you something to think about. Along with the easy and fun and warm parts of setting a project locally, I hope the weight of some of the political stuff has been inspiring too. I've been in Wellington for a week and I reckon it is a bit of a haven. But I've just arrived from my first international trip ever, where I visited the Pacific Northwest of America following GDC. What I saw was sometimes beautiful, but usually darkly astonishing. The homelessness crisis and drug abuse problems are results from a long history of neglect from local and federal government. The low common wages are a result of rampant unchecked greed, and the lack of even baseline social health care is bewildering. Some of the tiniest towns I passed through actually desperately need those franchises I mentioned earlier to create work, as dying industries leave entire generations without jobs. In New Zealand, just like about everywhere else, there's a massive housing affordability crisis, and of course there's the growing income inequality gap, which is a problem which both of our nations share. If a portion of people in games aren't making work or observations about what's happening in our homes, we're at risk of losing what I think is a profoundly significant piece of global history, and falling behind as an introspective form of expression. Even by taking inspiration from previous interpretations of a real time or place, you enrichen the cultural value of your game and align it with other forms of fiction in a positive and fresh way, in a way that games, I think, are ready to be aligned with. The times we're living in are full to the brim of injustices at the hand primarily of big corporations and governments willing to have their pockets lined to get power. Asylum seekers in Australia are still treated like bugs. Women are still, if quietly, treated as second best. Queer people in some countries are still murdered. This stuff isn't new, but the people in this room are young and talented and making stuff which people want to consume. It's important, I think, to realise that by digging into your own local histories, you can help shape cultural expectations which we put upon ourselves and expect from each other. Being brave enough to call out the problems and curious enough to explore them through interaction and narrative design, even retrospectively, is a meaningful way to make games. On top of this, it's also an extremely abundant resource for entertainment, if that's more your speed. I watched a few choice New Zealand films on my way here, and we've seen the impact those have had on the global media landscape. Why can't games use the same lore and landscapes to create new and relevant places to play? What you as a designer choose to take from your local histories and places is very open, which is why research is key. By dealing with real-world figures or events or even whole communities or towns, remember that you have the voice to highlight things which are otherwise left in the past or brushed over. On a lighter note, and almost on the other hand, it's an absolute joy to be making a game set in a real time and place, because I'm never short of things to learn and include, which are delightful, and help us to craft a uniquely considered version of Australia.